G'day, Professor Joseph Drew. This video is made for my friends at Leeton. When I was out and about, I was talking to people about what's happening in other rural local governments. The problem is when we only live in one area and we only deal with one local government, we get a little bit myopic about things. And most people were saying, oh wow, didn't know that. So this video is to set out those charts and things I was talking about so you can see. So what I'm going to do is show you a series of graphs about the entire cohort of rural local governments, which are 58 local governments in New South Wales. And what we're looking at is year-on-year percentage changes in total expenditure and then the other various expenditure components. I'm not looking at Leeton here. What I'm trying to do is give you an idea of what's happening across the sector. And you may or may not think your council's wonderful, but reality is, if a certain thing is typically happening across the sector, it's probably going to happen where you live too. Now, the big lines to look at in these graphs, I know there's a lot of lines, and more mathematically minded people want to look at the quartile 1, which marks a point 25% of councils are below quartile 1. And we'll want to look at quartile 3, 25% of councils above quartile 3. And when you think about quartile 1 and quartile 3 together, you're really getting a band of spread. It's very useful for mathematically minded people. The rest of you will probably just want to look at quartile 2, which is a median. If you put numbers in ascending order, it's the middle number. Or the mean, or the average, just like a cricketer's batting average. Add up all the numbers, divide by numbers. And most people think that's a decent measure of central tendency, both those figures combined. And for spread, as I say, you're looking at quartile 1 and quartile 3. So when I'm talking about typical outcomes here, I'm talking about the median and the mean. And typically we expect councils to do typical things. So have a look at percentage year-on-year change in expenditure. Goes back to 2018. You can see, I think it's quite fair. Up until 2022, you'd say, oh, look, it was bubbling along at around 5%. You go, oh, that's not too bad. The problem is your rate cap was never 5% during that period. It was typically 2%, 2.5% some years 1 point something percent. So you've got your expenditure going up by 5%, but your revenue is going up by around 2 and a bit percent. And you keep doing that year over year after year, obviously you're going to end up with a problem at some stage. So that was problematic in itself. But look at what happened after 22, in 2023 and 2024. The typical council in 2023 in rural councils in New South Wales, according to audited financial statement data, the typical council had the expenses go up by over 15%. And 2024, the typical council had their unit expenses go up by around 10%. That's a real problem because the rate cap didn't go up. It was stuck around the 2.5% mark. So you can see why most rural local governments in New South Wales are in strife. It's not because of bad management. You can't say that all 58 of them are horrible managers. It's because of things that happened that most local governments didn't have any control over. Inflation, it really started biting really hard for local governments, so a little bit behind consumers, 23. That's when it really started to hurt. And at the same time, we had all the COVID spending, profligate spending that should never have happened. I warned people on my YouTube site not to take the money, but most local governments did, urged on by the media, state government and federal government. It takes a while to get going that and for the ongoing cost to start being imputed and things, and that's what's coming through now as well. Okay, so now we're going to start looking at the components of expenditure. And the first one we're going to look at is depreciation because it's so important. It's not a make-believe figure. It's not an optional extra. It's not that at all. It measures a real thing which is really important. Depreciation measures the consumption or the deterioration in long life assets. We're talking about hard assets here, things like roads, buildings, bridges, that sort of stuff, okay? Now, it's governed by the Australian accounting standards, in particular AASB 116, which are backed by the International Financial Reporting Standards, and the AASB are backed by Commonwealth federal government law. It's not an optional extra. Now, depreciation expense, as I say, measures the consumption of those long-lived assets, and it turns up in your income statements as part of the calculation for your surplus or deficit. Now, if you've got break-even or surplus budgets and you have depreciation expense in there, and then you're allocating funds to reserves, you will likely have almost enough money to replace those assets when they're fully consumed. Now, because of the fact that accounting data is mostly historical, the depreciation tends to understate the actual future cost, but no one's got a crystal ball, no one knows what the future is. It's probably be about as good as it is. Now, my concern is people want to trivialise it, pretend it's not important. Well, you can for a couple of years, but your roads and bridges and things are falling down whether you like the word depreciation or not, and eventually you'll have to do work on them. And if you trivialise it, sideline it, don't treat it as a real expense, what you're going to probably find is that when you need to do work, you don't have the money. So let's have a look at those middle lines again. The colours change, but same deal. Median and the mean are the ones you really want to focus on a lot, and then you're looking at spread. And I think it's fair to say the year-on-year percentage change used to bubble along around the 4 or 5% mark until 2022. And that would be fine if your revenue year-on-year percentage increase was 4 or 5%, but it wasn't, as I've already discussed. So that's a real problem and explains why most rural councils are in strife. But there was a huge jump up in 23 and 24 financial years. Part of that's because of the Auditor General taking over a few years early, and there's a real move to standardise and move things up. There was a little bit of interesting things been happening around the times of the amalgamation, so some councils needed to go up because of those interesting adjustments that probably weren't warranted. We've also had, the state governments try to lumber us with the red fleet assets. We've also had new infrastructure spending because of these grants in the wake of COVID. Well, all those new things you build then have a depreciation expense associated with them. So there's a lot of things. 2023, 2024, massive increases year on year in excess of 8%. Your revenue certainly didn't go up. This is a real problem. Interestingly, depreciation is more or less outside of the control of your council, certainly in the short run. It's backed by law, it's audited, it's proper financial data, it reflects what's actually happening on the ground. You can't just change it because you don't like it. So this is an area of expense that's going up a lot. We don't have that much control over it. Now we're going to have a look at materials and contract expenses. And same deal, look at those middle lines. What's typical is probably typical of your council as well, but we're not looking at Leeton specifically here. You can see for most years it was bubbling around the 4 or 5% mark. Massive spike in 2021. You might recall how hard it was to get staff and materials. You might record the profligate spending at the behest of the media and the state government and the federal government, encourage everyone to go out and spend money, including local governments, and lots of them did and provided grants. That all had inflationary pressure, and then we had the inflationary pressure because we increased money supply, i.e. we made up new money. And we're still doing it globally and in Australia, and that results in inflation, as Milton Friedman famously proved beyond doubt, and just about every economist accepts. So massive increase in 2021 in the order of around 40% year-on-year percentage increase. 2022 it got better, but in the order of 11% year-on-year percent increase. Your revenue didn't increase by these numbers. Your revenue increased by around 2 to 3%. So if you've got the component of your expenditure increasing by 30%, 40%, look at 23, look at 24. Rarely has it been under 10% since those times. Obviously, you're going to have a real problem. The materials and contract expense, there is a little bit of control by council, but a lot of it also is non-discretionary. You have big items like electricity; it'll be 600,000 or 700,000 for your council. Insurance, 500,000 or 600,000. You can't just not have electricity. in council buildings and infrastructure. You can't just not insure your council property. Councils are actually faced with a lot of the same constraints we have in our household budgets. Only a small part of that material and contract expense is discretionary. That's where we do need to have control and be more efficient. But a lot of it's actually outside of our control. But anyway, that's typically what happened in rural councils. And if your council did a similar thing, well, then they were typical. So now we're going to look at staff expense change. And once again, we're looking at year-on-year percentage change. We're going from 2018 through to 2024 financial year, all financial years, all audited financial statements. And what we're particularly focused on are those middle lines, the median and the mean. They're the best measures of central tendency or typicalness. And you've got Q1 and Q3, which give you some idea of spread. So let's have a look at what was happening. Typically, you were bubbling around between 2 and 4% until up to and including 2022, which was really a great outcome because you've got to remember staff wages go up 3 or 4% every year, according to the Enterprise Bargaining Agreement, to keep a pace with cost of living pressures and things like that. So to control it like that was actually some pretty good work by our local governments. I'm sure no one thanked the local government. But in 2023, things took a turn for the worse. The typical council staff expenses went up 6%. 2024, typical council staff expenses went up by 8 or 9%. Now, once again, your revenue during this period wasn't going up by these things. Your rate cap was somewhere between 2 and 3%, maybe 3.5%, depending on the year and your population factor. It wasn't keeping up to the year-on-year percentage change in staff expenses. Now, where are these extra staff expenses coming about from? Well, one thing is all the extra staff state governments loading on to local government. Now, if you're in Australia and you want to solve your own financial problems in your higher tier of government, what you do is you kick the can down to someone that's lower down the pecking order, and that's local government, and that's what's been happening. All this extra work, all these new policies to make local government more transparent or whatever, and I've got no issue with those things, but all those extra things require extra work, which require extra staff, which increases your staff expenditure. Now, there is a great urban myth in Australia about how local government staff are sitting on their bottoms all day with nothing to do, leaning on their shovels. It's just not true. Not in rural local government where I've spent most of my time. I've been to 30, 40 councils. Typically, I see all the staff running around like a chook with their head cut off, trying to do far too much in far too little time. Typically, I find that most of your local government workers will be the same at Leeton. They've got skin in the game. They have their family and their children there and their parents there and their cousins and uncles and things. They live in the town. They're ratepayers themselves. They've got skin in the game. They want to do a good job because they personally see the effects of what they do. And that's why local governments, compared to in rural areas, compared to city councils, are much, much more efficient, much, much more effective because we all care about the place because we live there. So that's one urban myth I want to dispel and one cause of the increased staff expenses, the state government and federal government kicking their stuff down to us. The other cause, of course, is EBA. And the third thing is new programs and new things. And that all involves new staff. Particularly, as I said, you've heard me complain about the profligate spending urged on by the media, the state and federal governments after COVID. All that stuff had to be delivered, and a lot of it was delivered by your local government staff. I've said many, many times, and I will say it until the day I die, your most valuable asset in your council, and Leeton, just like any other rural council, is your staff. Look after your staff, because if you ever lose your staff, and yours are actually a good bunch, guys, you might whinge about them, but I'm comparing them to lots of other councils. If you ever lose your staff, you'll really have something to complain about. It's your biggest asset. Treasure them, support them, and certainly never turn on them. That's a recipe for disaster. Look, I hope that's given you a better idea of what's happening out there in every other council. The chances are if these councils are doing these things, so are yours. It's not good news. There's nothing good about it. I'm extremely concerned about state financial sustainability for local government. I'm particularly concerned about state government and federal government policies that keep impacting on financial sustainability. All I can do is give you the facts. congratulations if you got this far. You watched through the whole video. Typically people don't, because they don't want to hear all the facts, particularly if they don't comply with their preconceived ideas. But the numbers are the numbers. They come from audited statements. I can't do anything about them. All I can do is put them out there and try to show you that local government is under pressure too, just like you are, but actually a lot more. The things that local government have to use are the things that really went up in price, more so than their household budgets. Anyway, hope it was helpful. Thank you very much for your time. Goodbye.